the understanding that the planet is embodied, that it's inhabited, that we're not the only ones here, also brings a sense of personal responsibility. There's a sense of real emotional involvement in that. If you go and you dig into the ground without doing the appropriate rituals and looking at where you're digging into the ground and if it's a particularly sensitive area, if you just do that, then there's a sense that you might be personally, physically harming like a sadak, like a landowner spirit that might abide in that same location. So instead of just having this materialistic view of, oh, carbon in, carbon out, what's my carbon footprint? If I use a lot of carbon, then I just have to produce a certain amount of renewable energy and it'll offset it. And, that's sort of where we're at. It's very materialistic, it's very reductive, and, that's the essence of modern environmental activism and environmental science. But we're missing this emotional component. And I think that that's a major part of the reason why we don't feel motivated sufficiently to really do anything to change it. We don't feel this personal onus to not cause harm to these other beings that are living in nature.
I'm Olivia Clementine, and this is Love and Liberation. Today, our guest is Erik Jampa Andersson. Erik is a Tibetan medicine practitioner, Sorg Kong International teacher, and meditation instructor trained through the Shangshung Institute of Tibetan Medicine and Sorg Kong International. Erik is one of the few Westerners to have completed a comprehensive education in the Gushi, as well as clinical training in Tibetan herbalism, dietetics, and manual therapies. He maintains a private practice in Topanga, California, and is on faculty at the Sorg Institute School of Tibetan Medicine at Pure Land Farms. Well, I'm so happy to have you here.
I appreciate it. It's really great to be able to talk to you.
I would love to hear a little background on Tibetan science of healing, or Sowa Rigpa, its origins, and just a general thing to kind of ground us in to what it is.
Sure. So Tibetan medicine, like a lot of things that we find in Tibetan culture and spirituality, things usually exist on this sort of scale of like the outer truth, the inner truth, and the secret truth. And that's very much the case with Tibetan medicine as well. It's one of the five major sciences in the Tibetan and Indian traditions. Those formed the foundations for the Buddhist universities like Nalanda that existed in India, and then also places like Samye Monastery in Tibet. They all followed this sort of model for education that followed these five major and five minor sciences. So among the five major sciences, we find things like linguistics, we find things like logic, but we also find medicine, and we find Nangdun Rikpa, which is the inner science. So these were, just to sort of contextualize the body of knowledge, it's really placed at this very high level along with the Buddha Dharma. And the science of healing, so Sowa Rigpa, the term that we usually use for Tibetan medicine, it means the science of healing. And my teacher, Dr. Nida Chenaktsang, he prefers for us to use this term as opposed to something like traditional Tibetan medicine, which is sort of the alternative, because it's really this healing science that exists on a much wider in a much wider range geographically. We find it in Tibet. We also find it in Bhutan. They call it indigenous Bhutanese medicine there. In Nepal, they call it Amchi medicine. In Mongolia, they call it traditional Mongolian medicine. So you find these really similar traditions that have the same basic philosophical structures, and they exist in very different ways and in different cultures. So with Tibetan medicine, sort of the internal, sort of mythos of it is that it's originally based on teachings from the historical Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, and that he manifested as the medicine Buddha, as Sangye Menla. And during that time, he taught the Gyushi, the four tantras of Tibetan medicine, and really gave a very complete explanation of the body in balance and the diseased body and how to treat that and reverse disorders. So these teachings were they popped up over time in Tibet. There was a medical conference held in the 8th century hosted by King Trisong Detsen. He was the king who invited Padmasambhava to Tibet, and Shantarakshita and these other figures that helped disseminate Buddhism in the early wave of Buddhism in Tibet. And they held a medical conference at Samye that included physicians from all over Eurasia. They're known as the 9 wise physicians, and they came from places like Mongolia and China and India, and they came sharing their medical wisdom that they had accumulated over the centuries in their own sort of homelands. And this information was all compiled, and then it was sort of imbued with this wisdom of the medicine Buddha via a text that was purportedly brought back from India and then translated into Tibetan. And the text itself was hidden at Samye Monastery, this sort of compilation of all the healing knowledge that they had compiled in the 8th century. And then in the 12th century, we had this figure named Yutok Yunten Gompo, the Younger. There were 2 Yutoks. Yutok Yunten Gompo, the Younger, so he really codified the Tibetan medical tradition and finalized the 4 tantras as we use them today. And along with those, he also included this cycle of spiritual practices known as the Yutok Ningtik, the heart essence of Yutok. And he taught both of those side by side. They were considered as 2 jewels. And the medical information was really considered to be for everyone. It was very ecumenical. There was no requirement that those that would study Tibetan medicine or receive Tibetan medicine or practice it would be Buddhist. It was for everyone. It was sort of a human birthright that we would have access to this ancient healing knowledge. And then the Yutok Ningtik was a little more refined for Buddhist practitioners. That's something that's really more focused on this inner alchemical process of liberation. So that was stabilized in the 12th century, and then around the 16th century it was institutionalized, and Chakbori, the first medical university in Tibet, was founded by the regent of the 5th Dalai Lama, who was also very likely his son, which was a bit of a scandal, but no one knew about it. And he established Chakbori University and started the educational system that still exists for Tibetan doctors. So it's been refined and developed since that time, and it's existed without any sort of a break in the lineage, which is something that we can't really say for Chinese medicine or for Ayurveda, which are easily its closest relatives in the ancient medicine world. But they both experienced significant periods of decline and oppression. In India, there were periods in which Ayurvedic doctors would have their hands chopped off if they were caught checking pulses. And then, of course, we have Mao Zedong's influence with Chinese medicine, with Taoist medicine, which has been turned into this TCM tradition that's really sort of an adaptation of Chinese medicine. So Tibetan medicine never experienced that. It was basically it was brought to the Tibetan plateau, and then they had centuries of centuries of unbroken scientific exploration.
And where does that stand now with the Chinese invasion and, obviously the destruction of a lot of Tibetan culture? How has Tibetan medicine been impacted by that?
So Tibetan medicine got out very early. A lot of that was actually due to the efforts of a medical historian and a doctor named Dr. Jampa Trinley. And he was an excellent medical historian in the 20th century, and he was responsible for bringing a lot of the texts out of Tibet and also bringing a lot of the wisdom out of Tibet. And they established Dharamsala Mensikang fairly quickly in exile. So Dharamsala Mensikang is now sort of it's the new Chakbori. Chakbori was destroyed in Lhasa, unfortunately. The mountain still stands. It's the other sort of major hill in Lhasa, but the school is no longer there. There is Lhasa Mensikang, which is another major Tibetan medical institute. And then there's Dharamsala Mensikang in India and different places across Asia. So they got out fairly quickly, and it was an interesting sort of situation because Mao was interested in the efficacy of Tibetan medicine. There's even certain reports that he was interested in sort of the mystical capabilities of Tibetan medicine, particularly its alchemical tradition. But a lot of that is sort of hearsay, and it's sort of interesting secret firsthand accounts over the years. But he didn't destroy it. by any means. And I don't think he understood it well enough or had enough control over it to destroy it. But it's only really now when we get this really hardcore capitalist influence coming into Chinese Tibet that we start to see a little bit of bastardization of the lineage and, ineffective medicines and things like that. But it's still very much alive even in Chinese occupied Tibet.
It's good to hear. And how about you? I mean, you're just like a young lad. How did you get into this?
So it sort of found me. I came into Buddhism when I was very young. I knew I wanted to be a Tibetan Buddhist when I was 13. And then I ended up meeting my root Lama, Lama Tsultrim Allione, when I was 14. I've been a close student of hers since then. So even though I wasn't raised in it by my birth family, I sort of I was raised in it otherwise, and intellectually I was very much raised in it. And then when I was older and going into college, I I did Tibetan studies for a while at Naropa University, but I decided that I really wanted to do something that was a bit more in depth, something I could really sink my teeth into in a more traditional way. And an opportunity arose to study the Gyushi in its entirety and do the training for a Tibetan doctor with the Shangshung Institute. So I did that. And then I met my medicine guru, Dr. Nida Chanaktsang, shortly thereafter and started studying with him. I received more teachings in Tibetan medicine and also on the Yutok Nyingtik. And then eventually he sent me to Nepal for my residency, for my internship. When I was at Naropa, I did get very ill at one point. I had a pretty terrible diet, and I got very ill just with this digestive sort of issue. And I went to Western doctors, I went to nutritionists, and no one could really take care of it. No one could quite figure out what was wrong. So I went to a Tibetan doctor. I was in Boulder, so I had the luxury of being in sort of a Buddhist community where there were Tibetan doctors. And within a week of being on her medicine and with the dietary changes that she had suggested, I was significantly better for the first time in months. I was, before that I was waking up every morning and vomiting, going to school, coming home and vomiting, doing some homework, vomiting, going to bed, vomiting in the middle of the night. It was horrendous. So I was amazed to have relief so quickly. And it was really even after one day, she gave me a dose of alchemical medicine, what we call Rinchen Rilbu, or precious pills. And I didn't throw up after that. I didn't have that sort of a reaction again. And then I just got incrementally better and better and better. And other issues began to go away as well. My mental health improved significantly. My sleep improved. My whole life really changed because these physical ailments were taken off my shoulders. So I had a lot of faith in Tibetan medicine. And it was shortly after that time that I had the offer to go do this Tibetan medicine school. So I was like, yeah, hell yeah.
Well, this is great. This is a good segue because we were going to talk a little bit today about how Sowa Rigpa can help us create healthful relationships and society.
Yeah, I mean, the more that I teach, the more that I find these little areas of Tibetan medicine that are really incredibly unique and fascinating and can really change the entire way that we're living. And it was certainly what brought me to Tibetan medicine, or part of what brought me to Tibetan medicine in the first place. I've never, my mother was always very interested in holistic healthcare. I always had access to, herbs and to naturopathy and nutrition. And, it was always a part of my life growing up. But I think probably for most people in that sort of situation, I had this natural tendency to rebel against it. And it was this sort of like, no, I want to I want to control my own body. And if I want to eat junk food, I want to eat junk food. I wouldn't have ever called myself sort of a health nut or I never would have expected that I would have gone into healthcare professionally. But I was really fascinated by those other aspects of Sowa Rigpa, how it was really this sort of scientific edge of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And it was able to integrate the physical sciences and our biology and physiology with these philosophical truths that I'd been studying for most of my life. And the thing that really interests me, particularly now, I'm sort of slowly working on a book on the subject and have been doing a lot of research on it, is really the way that Sowa Rigpa intersects with environmentalism, and how that also intersects with our personal, physical health, our psychological health, our spiritual health, our sociological health, and how all of these things are supposed to exist together. When we talk about holistic healthcare, a lot of times that's super reductive. And actually, when people are talking about holistic healthcare, they're just talking about healthcare that isn't based on pharmaceuticals and, sort of allopathic biomedicine. But that doesn't necessarily make it holistic. There's plenty of herbalists out there who are not holistic herbalists. They're not treating the whole person. They're saying, oh, you have this, symptom. Oh, well, this herb is really good for that. Therefore, you can take it and, it'll help you. And it's this strictly symptom-based allopathic approach that doesn't have any real holistic depth to it. And even with traditional medical systems as they're practiced here, things like TCM is actually pretty good about it, even in its post-Mao sort of iteration, because usually practitioners are at least privy to the psychological changes that come with the seasons and so on and so forth. But with some other traditional medical systems, you still fall into this trap where it's just physical medicine, or it's just quote unquote energy healing, or it's just sort of a psychological exercise. But there isn't anything that's really all of those and bringing in the social aspect. And it's definitely my feeling, based on the literature and based on the way that Soa Rigpa has really been disseminated and practiced over the centuries, that it does truly uphold that. And it really sits at this intersection that's so incredibly valuable, especially in this day and age.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I mean, I think it's also, I remember that's why I stopped doing herbal consults, because it would be so difficult when someone would come in and they couldn't sleep, and you knew all the reasons they couldn't sleep, but all they wanted were the herbs, right? And
Exactly.
you would say, but no, there's so much going on in your mind and your environment that's inhibiting you from sleeping.
Absolutely. And there's so many circumstances where it comes down to the factors of the world in which we live, and it's not something that's fair. It's not something that we have to deal with, but also something that we're forced to deal with. I have patients who they're working multiple jobs, including jobs as school teachers and positions that they should really be able to subsist and focus on their work. But they're so stressed by money. They're so stressed by unrealistic work expectations and, grading papers late into the night, things like that, that they just don't have good mental health. And it's really difficult to help them, because you can help them with the physical stuff, you can help them even with the mental stuff, and potentially with the energetic stuff, but you can't change capitalism. I can't change it as a Tibetan medicine practitioner from my clinic. I can do what I can as, an activist and as a socially engaged person to try to change the fabric of our society in that way. But it's a giant beast that's really standing in the way. And there's only so many herbs that I can prescribe or that I can offer to people before, you run up against that wall.
Yeah, it's so true. I appreciate you bringing that in, kind of the capitalist mentality, or just this kind of, what can you, I guess, having compassion for people also that come in and are really struggling, and they really are kind of pushed up against the wall, and
Yeah.
they make a living, or they have a passion doing something where they have to be up in the middle of the night at a restaurant or a hospital, and it's really wreaking havoc on their well-being.
Absolutely. And the way that we self-identify, the way that we place value on ourselves and on the work that we do is really, it's imposed upon us, or the grid that we sort of evaluate ourselves with is imposed upon us. If we're not successful by these certain markers, then we feel like we're failures. And that's really the biggest problem I feel with sort of a consumption-based society, is that you can't have endless consumerism without convincing people that they need to consume because what they have isn't enough. So we exist in these traditions like Buddhism or Indian Dharmic traditions, or even just a sort of more holistic way of living within monotheistic traditions. And we really try to find these deeper meanings, these deeper essential core values that we can connect with, whether it's a relationship with God, if you're a theistic, spiritual person, or, an experience of the true nature of mind, or our Buddha nature, if you're Buddhist. but then we're existing in this society that's constantly bombarding us with a very different narrative, completely opposite sorts of rhetoric. And I don't feel like we're quite adept enough yet to be able to weed those out and figure out what exactly is true and what we should be basing our lives on, and what's actually strictly fantasy and is just going to lead us to suffering. It's very difficult to exist in a world without some degree, a world like this without some degree of, financial stability and personal professional success. And these can all be very reifying to our egoic sort of narrative. And then we're trying to do the complete opposite thing with Buddhist practice or with any sort of Dharma practice. We're trying to sort of realistically look at the ego and look at what the real constituents are of the self. And if there's anything there, then it's something that's divine and based in love. And yet the neoliberal attitude is the complete opposite of that. It's based in aggression and competition and getting to the top before someone else does.
So good. I think about this all the time. I'm so glad you're speaking of this. I mean, as you know, I think being practitioners and being in this world, how do you, I mean, I want to know from you, like, because you are traveling the world offering your medical care and teaching.
Mhm.
And how do you, in your own mind, kind of bridge the two of, surviving and then also having a pure heart and committing to the Dharmic path?
Yeah, I think motivation is really important as a Mahayanist. That comes down, that's sort of the essence. If you do something with the proper motivation, then the effects are going to be very different karmically, and also just the literal effect that it has on the world. People can sense those sorts of things. If someone is out there because they really want to, boost up their own position and pump up their ego, or if someone's out there because they have something valuable to say and they want to help people.
Mm.
And that motivation, as a practitioner, I'm constantly refining that and bringing in, what is my true intention and trying to touch base with that. And I would hope, my deed to be of benefit. I think that if my intention were different, I probably would have gone into a different line of work, because this isn't exactly an easy path, or something that's, just phenomenally lucrative, but it's important. And it's important on this individual level, being able to see patients and work with people directly and change their lives and make them feel better and give them the capability to get up and do the work that they're doing. But also on this grander level of, talking to people and trying to change some of the narratives through which we live our lives. And I think that some of the greatest benefits that Soa Rigpa has, especially for the Western world, especially for a world that's really steeped in the scientism, which I'm not entirely adverse to. I think that science is very important, but this sort of heartless, materialistic version of scientism is quite negative. I think that it's not doing us any favors on the grounds of increasing our social group cohesion and bringing people together and supporting people and living their best lives.
So what, in terms of Soa Rigpa, what are some of the qualities that it encourages? Just, as an individual, how we actually are in relationship with other people and our environment? Like, what are some of the tenets for good connection, right? Good relational
Right. So Soa Rigpa, it basically, we use four sort of methods of treatment in, well, I should back up. We identify four conditioning factors that cause disorders to arise. So the basic underlying core of imbalance is actually the three poisonous emotions, the three mental afflictions. So these base mental afflictions are well known within Buddhism and also in pre-Buddhist Indian traditions. And these are primarily ignorance, which is more like stupidity because there's a sense of stupor to it. There's a sense of heaviness and dullness, but that kind of ignorance. And then there's desire, which could also be described as craving or attachment or clinging. And then there's anger, which is also described as hatred or aversion. And so these three root poisons, these have a common root in and of themselves, and that's unawareness. It's a lack of acknowledgement and full integration of our true existence, the true nature of our existence. In a modern context, we could say that this is living out of step with sort of quantum reality as we know it to be. And it's funny because it really takes a lot more than cognitive understanding. And we know that because we can look at any, quantum physicists, and they're not walking around as these great enlightened Buddhas. You can still have very worldly issues, even if you fully cognitively understand better than anyone else on the planet, potentially, that things are not inherently existent in the way that we perceive them to be. So that unawareness ultimately gives rise to these afflictive mental states, of ignorance, desire, and aversion. And then from there, imbalances of the three humors, sort of the three basic energies, exist. That's how imbalances originally start. That's what creates the roots of those imbalances. But then they don't necessarily arise unless they're met with these four conditioning factors, what are called kyen in Tibetan. So these four conditioning factors are diet, lifestyle, time, which involves both season and also sort of time on a 24-hour clock, and also periods of someone's life. And then the final aspect is provocation. And that's a really important thing that I'd like to talk about probably in a little more depth in a minute. But the provocation aspect is incredibly important. It's really fascinating, vital information that Tibetan medicine can offer us. But the second area of lifestyle, which is also, you could call it behavior, chulam, which is sort of like the path of engagement, like how we engage with people and with the world. And that's considered to be one of the primary conditions for imbalance. And you could see that, particularly if you note those three sort of mental afflictions as being the base roots of disease, because those arise quite frequently based on our behavioral choices, the situations we put ourselves in, the societies that we exist in, so on and so forth. So Yutoken Tengompo, when he taught about this, when he wrote about it, in the Gyushi, he talks about these various levels of conduct. So he talks about, behavioral conduct in relation to sort of circumstances physiologically, things as sort of straightforward as if you need to pee, then you should pee and you shouldn't hold it. Or, if you need to sneeze or something, then you should sneeze and you shouldn't hold it. Or things like, you shouldn't strain your eyes too much, and you shouldn't expose yourself to extremely loud sounds, things along those lines. There's also some pretty solid practical advice, like you shouldn't cross bodies of water and in shoddy boats, things that are very helpful for maintaining our lifespan and our health.
Yeah.
And then he also has spiritual conduct. He talks about, how are we supposed to engage if we're spiritual practitioners, and, what kind of philosophy should we uphold, which view should we maintain. And he talks a lot in that case about generating compassion, maintaining very much on the Mahayana sort of path as a bodhisattva, practicing altruism. He also has this section on worldly conduct, and it's one of my favorite parts of the Gyushi. It's in the explanatory tantra of Tibetan medicine, which is the second of the four tantras. And the first line of it is that virtuous worldly conduct is the foundation of all good qualities. Jikten michupa yunten kungi shi. So I think that that's really profound in and of itself. This is a traditional Tibetan text written by, or at least severely edited by, a Buddhist master. And to say, virtuous worldly conduct, jikten, jikten means like the universal. It's of this world, the basis of decay. It's that kind of conduct that's really the foundation of good qualities. So even though we have this phenomenal view that's very lofty and taking sort of, quantum reality into consideration, we still have to really pay close attention to the way that we're engaging societally with other people. And it includes some really solid pieces of advice, like keeping your word and maintaining your commitments. It also, he suggests to us that we shouldn't give power to evil people, which is probably a pretty germane piece of advice for this day and age.
How funny is it, though, that some of these things are so basic, but we don't do them?
Absolutely. These basic ways to just exist. But the whole thing is really focused on acting with a loving heart, acting with altruism, and engaging in society in a way that's supporting other people and helping people. Yutok says that if you have money, then you should give it generously. You should work to sustain yourself, but if you're wealthy, then you should share that and you should help other people with it. There's a lot of aspects of his teachings that are very worldly while also being very profound. And I think that those are some of the most important teachings for this day and age, so that we don't fall into the trappings of sort of spiritual materialism or spiritual bypassing, which I think is really common, especially in really sort of messy world that we live in today. But Yutok pushes us to not get stuck in that, to go beyond our sort of lofty view and recognize that beings are suffering and that it's actually our responsibility as bodhisattvas to help them. In his ngundro for the Yutok Nyingtik, his preliminary practices, which set people onto the path of Tibetan Tantra, he has a sort of, a relative ngundro, a sort of common ngundro, and then he has an uncommon ngundro, which are very, very sort of common features of tantric ngundro. But then he has the routine preliminary practices, and these routine preliminary practices are the sorts of activities that you take up after you complete your ngundro, and they include things like helping the poor, helping people and animals who are struggling and suffering, establishing medical clinics, helping the teachings of Tibetan medicine and the teachings of the inner science of Buddha Dharma to flourish and to spread. So even for people who are really on the tantric path and practicing this very serious form of Tibetan Buddhism, they're still pushed to, don't leave worldly affairs out there. That's part of your path. For a doctor, seeing patients and treating people is actually part of their practice. It's part of the path.
I like your reflection on the spiritual bypassing. This is a way to not separate the two.
And that's what Tibetan medicine tells us. We know that if you're fully enlightened, if you're not experiencing unawareness, if you're completely integrated with the true nature of phenomena, then your humors won't become imbalanced. So you're not going to experience disease. You won't experience elemental imbalance. But most of us are not in that situation. Most of us are still experiencing things with this dualistic sort of karmic vision, and therefore we experience imbalance. But the beauty with Tibetan medicine, and this really, a lot of this, I think, is also reflected in the Kala Chakra Tantra, which is probably the most important tantric system, at least of the new schools in Tibet. And, it talks about, similar to the Hermetic notion of, as above, so below, it says, as it is outside, so it is inside. And as it is inside, so it is in the other, being the mandala of the deity. So it takes the Hermetic, green or emerald tablet notion and takes it a step further into spiritual practice. But we can't ignore that. We can't ignore the fact that our physiological health is actually tied to the health of the exterior world, to the outer universe, and to those circumstances, and vice versa. And then all of that is reflected in our spiritual path. All of that is present in the mandala. The mandala of the deity does contain all of the elements of the outer world. It's just in a different form. We're using it in a different purpose. But they're all connected, all three levels of the outer universe, the inner universe, and then the spiritual blueprint for enlightenment.
Say we, quelled the three poisons and, we lived a virtuous life. We weren't yet at a state of rainbow bodies. So we still wanted to exist on the terrestrial field. Would this mean that we would just live really well, right? Like our inner system was in balance, or outer system is in balance, but we'd still be a human on Earth.
Right.
Where does that kind of fit in terms of real life existence?
So it's traditionally taught that there's a couple of pieces to that. So one would be with very high lamas, like someone like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, or someone like the Buddha. It's traditionally taught that those beings do not die sort of outside of their power, outside of their control. They, quote unquote, manifest impermanence for the benefit of their disciples. They pass into parinirvana. That's the sort of, the parlance that's used when a master dies. They don't say that they died or they passed away or what have you. They say that they passed into parinirvana. So it's, believed that for someone like the Dalai Lama, or for like a really great practitioner, not just these, sort of god kings, but also for ordinary yogis and yoginis who commit their lives to practice, and a lot of masters that are in caves in the Himalayas that we'll never know about, who are attaining great accomplishments today. But for people like that, they're not necessarily, if they're fully beyond the dualistic vision, then they're not going to be afflicted in the same way that we are by the three humors. But they will still manifest impermanence for our benefit, because nothing can stay in one state forever, other than the state of enlightenment. So there's that, and there's also certainly, even in the Vajrayana tradition, I feel like I don't know if this is directly answering your question, but it is related to it, I promise. But there's a tendency for Vajrayana practitioners, particularly Westerners who are sort of coming to it and don't have always the full context for it, to kind of abandon concern for the body in this loftier sort of search for liberation. I've met quite a troubling number of practitioners, actually, that don't seem to feel any personal responsibility to take care of their body. But it's actually one of the tantric samayas. It's actually one of the tantric commitments that are made in tantric Buddhism. It's to not damage your body as it's the abode of the deity. And for most people, that means things like, you don't commit suicide and you can't self-harm. But the standard American diet is self-harm. A lot of our behaviors are self-harm. Even supporting, a society that's so rabidly consumer-based is also that's self-harm. Being so dependent on fossil fuels is self-harm. It's harming our bodies. It's harming our ability to subsist on this planet. It's harming the capacity for future generations to be raised in a world in which they have the freedom and the time to practice the Dharma, or to be of benefit, or even just to enjoy their lives. So I think that we need to be a little bit broader with the way that we view our spiritual responsibilities as Buddhists, but not even just as Buddhists, really as anyone. If we're taking care of ourselves, if we're taking our vitamins and minerals and our omega-3 supplements, and we're, keeping a really healthy diet, but then we have these really wretched internal monologues that keep turning, or we have a lot of aggression and aversion towards our neighbors, and we just, have awful interactions with them and make their lives a living hell. Or if we're, constantly just buying and buying more and more and more plastic goods and ultimately polluting the planet that we live on, then you're not doing it right. You're missing a few aspects of what it is to really live in a state of balance and in a way that's not harming yourself or others.
In gratitude to our listeners and to support the making of this podcast, we want to remind you that as Love and Liberation listeners, you receive a discount in our shop. We have a botanical shop and online courses, relational courses, and at checkout, if you just put the code Love and Liberation, you'll receive a discount. So go take a look at oliviaclementine.com and enjoy. And also, if you're a regular listener, I want to request from you to go to iTunes and to leave a review and rating. This really helps other folks find the podcast and gives us feedback. So thank you in advance for doing that. I really appreciate it. So let's get back to today's conversation. You're bringing up so many important points. I want to break down every single thing you're saying. I'm not even kidding. Everything you're saying, I'm like, can we talk about that and that? Like, there's just so much in there, right? That, like, I think so many of us are processing in our minds and our hearts exactly what you're sharing, but maybe haven't heard it verbalized. What we're seeing in our day to day in this world, and the pain it creates to even just witness it or be a part of it.
We speak of the Buddha as being the great physician. That's a very well-loved epithet of his is, Mempa Chenpo, the great doctor. And sometimes people don't realize where that comes from. It's not just this sort of, lovely notion of, oh, he healed all of us, so, he's the great doctor. He really was. That's really what he was doing. The Four Noble Truths that the Buddha taught, that structure actually has an origin, and it's Ayurveda. It comes from the Ayurvedic tradition of ancient Indian medicine, and it's following a really basic medical protocol of diagnosing the problem, identifying the etiology, coming to a prognosis, and then providing the treatment regimen. That's precisely what the Buddha did. He identified that our main disease as embodied beings is suffering. We have chronic suffering. We have a chronic case of the suffering. So that's our disease. And then okay, well, where did it come from? Sometimes that's a question that, modern allopathic clinical medicine isn't always asking. It's more about, okay, it shows this on the test, so we give this antibiotic or this medicine and yada, yada. But, we have to consider what the etiology is. We have to look at what caused this in the first place. And for the Buddha, he said, it's attachment, it's addiction. Addiction is what's causing our suffering in the sort of the broadest sense of the term. Our addiction to our dualistic perception, our addictions to our unhealthy relationships, our addictions to consumption, our addictions to wanting more power and more praise. These are the roots of why we're sick. This is what caused it. So then he says, okay, what's the prognosis? The prognosis is that it's hard to treat, but you can. It'll take a while, and you have to stay really strict with the treatment regimen, but it is possible to treat it. It is possible to be cured from suffering. So then he provides us with his treatment approach, which is the Noble Eightfold Path, and the teachings that follow.
Yeah, as you're sharing, I feel the significance of people really stepping out of their day-to-day, right? Like this is really where having some kind of personal time be with our inner life so we can shift the bindings and actually start to reflect on what's creating suffering for each of us. It does take this kind of hitting the brakes when all of the world is telling you to just keep going and to just keep consuming, keep staying busy. And I love your continual reflection on our misunderstanding of true success.
Right.
What it means to be a worthwhile being in our society is so skewed and continues to create further suffering. And it really shows you how much courage and self-trust we have to have as individuals, and being surrounded by people like you that can see other ways of being in this world.
Right. And maintaining the integrity of these teachings in sort of their full context without letting them be used against us in the way that Western spirituality has been used against us for so long is, I think, really important, because we have this tendency. I mean, we can see this so clearly with the sort of mindfulness movement, especially with this concept of corporate mindfulness, which, in some cases is different. Sometimes people go in and it's more about changing the work culture and changing the way that people express issues that they have or concerns and trying to make it a little more, humanitarian. However, a lot of this corporate mindfulness movement is really about getting people to be more productive, helping people move past their stress instead of using it as an opportunity to say, hey, is something that I'm doing not really healthy? Is this imbalanced? Am I not quite approaching this in a way that's balanced and healthy for me and for the people around me? This is us an opportunity to say, okay, actually, one of the fears that, it's imbalanced in the first place is these, behavioral lifestyle circumstances and the circumstances of the society in which we live. So we actually have to fix that too. We can't just continue living in a really sick society and forcing ourselves to adapt to it and become more, productive and more efficient at it and expect ourselves to get better. We're using very different, rubrics to determine how we're doing. It's like you can say, well, I'm doing really well because I made $100,000 this year, but I also worked 60 hours a week. I didn't get much sleep. I'm really ill. My digestion failed. My adrenals are shot. And, I broke up with my partner because he couldn't handle how much I was working. It's like there's different ways that we can measure the way that, we're living and whether we're happy or whether we're successful. And a lot of those are not actually in our best interest. Those are usually the ones that have been imposed upon us by the powerful.
Oh, we're just left here with the truth. Okay, well, on the flip side of this, if somebody's really struggling or they just are unable to access a state of joy, what would be some suggestions to increase our level of joy, simple joy?
Mm-hmm.
Am I going too far in another direction?
We can go in whatever direction you
Okay,
want to
okay.
go
Well, what made
in.
me think of this? Because I was just like, I don't think a lot of people are experiencing basic joy. People are
Right.
experiencing, I get this, and so I'm happy, or I was
Mhm.
successful at this, but I don't think a lot of people are necessarily investigating how can a sense of natural joy arise in my life.
I think for a lot of people, it's a big question of where do we think we're going to find it? Where do we think joy actually comes from? A lot of it is this very conditional, these conditional circumstances that we think, okay, well, I'll feel joy when I have, a good partner and a stable job and a house and my student loans are paid off and, I can work as I wish, a certain number of hours a week and I can have enough vacation time. We have all of these concepts about what it is that's going to make us happy. And they're usually based in the same sorts of principles of consumption that they've always been based in. We've always had this feeling of basic deficiency based on our separation from the ground of being and this constant desire to return to that and to reunite with it. And that's where a lot of this, craving for external circumstances and external phenomena comes from. It's this desire to come back to union. That's really the root of the word yoga. It's to yoke, it's to join or to bring together. And it's also the root of religion, religare or religio, these mean to bind. It's to sort of rejoin, to come back together. And I think that that's more where we're going to find happiness. That's where we're really going to find that experience of joy and bliss. It's the basic nature of our mind. His Holiness Rangjung Dorje, the third Karmapa, he has a great quote. He said, "We're born in bliss, we live in bliss, and we die in bliss." And that's just the natural state of things. That's the way it is if we don't muddy it up with all of our concepts and our attachments and aversions and our dualistic vision that's based in egocentricity, based on this idea that I individually, permanently, absolutely exist, and everything outside of me is separate than the me that really exists. And that puts us immediately at odds with the universe, as opposed to recognizing that the essence of our being is actually awakening. It's awareness. It's Buddha. It's this state of bliss. There's bliss in the just inherent experience of reality. We just don't always see it because we fill it with all of these other notions, all of these other concepts. And this can, for some people, that can in and of itself seem a little spiritual bypassy. There's a sense of like, well, no, but I'm actually hungry because I'm not making enough money to feed myself or my family.
Right.
And I have a hard time going to the absolute in those sorts of circumstances, because there's also just the level of, no, we need to change these relative circumstances because folks are suffering, people are, and beings are experiencing suffering. But if you take a really wide lens and you zoom out at the really grand picture of the universe over infinite time, after over beginningless and endless time, then you have constantly shifting circumstances. That's all you have is just this conglomeration of change, of interdependent causes and conditions that are arising and falling, beings that are coming to existence and dying. Again, this is the meaning of the word universe, jikten in Tibetan. It means the basis of decay. So if we can zoom out from our personalized individualistic narrative and stay in the base experience of awareness, the base experience of just things as they are, then we can find a natural sort of bliss. We can find a natural innate quality that others might call God. It's a really similar concept, even though it's philosophically quite different. But the same idea that the essence, in all of us, and the essence in all phenomena, is this sort of divinity, and its essence is love. I also feel like that inherently, His Holiness the Dalai Lama talks about this a lot, which unfortunately sometimes causes misperceptions about Buddhism. I think a lot of folks, especially in the West, who've read a couple of Dalai Lama quotes, have these ideas that Buddhists, the only thing we care about is, just be kind. And that's the whole of Buddhist philosophy. That's what we're spending all day doing. All the books that we're reading are all just saying, be kind over and over again. And really, it goes quite a bit deeper than that, even though that's really the radiant expression of it. That's the way that it manifests in the world. And if we lose that piece, then we've really lost, we've tossed the baby out with the bathwater. But if we simply change our frame of reference and our point of focus from ourself to others, to turning that around and becoming of service to others, then it's impossible not to find joy in that. That's really the essential teaching in Mahayana, is that self-centered activities, self-serving activities are never going to bring us joy. No matter how hard you try, if you're really focused on trying to make yourself, better off and separate yourself further from those around you and the circumstances that you're, enmeshed in, then you're just going to suffer more. It's going to be it's a catch-22. You have to turn that around and develop a heart of altruism, because that's much closer to the essence of who we actually are. That's much closer to the core of existence, as opposed to, these divisive, dualistic notions of self and other.
What a good thing to remember. All we need to do, first of all, is just turn our gaze outwards and to start being less self-obsessed. That's one very practical way to start to bring more joy in our life. And all of us can do that. There's no one that's exempt from that, right? No matter what our circumstances.
Absolutely. And also turning inward to our own shadow aspects, the things that we're hiding in the recesses of our consciousness that we're not really fully addressing, because those are usually the things that come up and screw with our equilibrium and cause us to lash out at other people. When we're not addressing our inner insecurities about, people thinking that you talk too much. And then when someone comes into your life who talks too much, it'll drive you crazy. And that might cause you to lash out at them and to, turn them into a villain, because you're really reacting to your own insecurity that you talk too much. But if this other person is doing it, then you have someone to point it at. It makes a lot more sense to us to blame someone else and point outside of ourselves for the root of our issues, instead of looking at the things that we're not looking at. So I think another major, major, major piece of all of this is for people, particularly people who are in positions of extreme privilege and power, to consider what the underpinnings are of the way that they're engaging in the world, to look into their psyche and say, okay, what are some of these sort of inner demons lurking in the shadows of my mind, and how can we bring them to light and make them conscious? It's an old Jungian quote. It's that enlightenment doesn't come by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And I think that it's going to be impossible for us to improve the social circumstances that we live in, or our own psychological health, or our physiological health, if we're not really taking the time and devoting some energy to turning inward and cleaning up shop, cleaning out our own closet of the skeletons that have accumulated in there, so that we're not, lashing out at other people and making other people's lives more difficult.
That's so good, right? And like, usually when we do that, I know for myself, the moment I actually start to turn towards the darkness, I actually feel better. Like, you think it's going to be
Totally.
horrible, but you immediately feel some sense of liberation, just relief, right?
I mean, my Lama, of course, Lama Sultram, but her work with feeding your demons, which is sort of a psychologized adaptation of the Tibetan chud practice from Machik Lapchen. It's an 11th century tradition from Tibet. But her sort of take on it and the way that she's used it has been really remarkable. And the foundational philosophy behind it is that we should feed and not fight that which we consider to be demons in our life. And I think that that's so essential, especially talking about medicine, especially talking about ecology, especially talking about social issues. We need to feed these, deprived, suffering aspects of our psyche, instead of constantly fighting it. This conflict is what creates a lot of the tension and creates, the suffering that goes along with it. And she even teaches that in regards to health. And, it's really easy to see when people get like cancer. If someone passes away after dealing with cancer, we'll say, they died after a long battle with cancer. This is something that they were fighting. They were, aggressively acting against something that's within their body. And if you just think about that, with the Secret and all of this, like sort of, pseudo-spiritual, law of attraction ideology, psychology. It's like, what do you think you're doing? You know, if you're fighting something inside of yourself, if you're battling depression, if you're battling anxiety, if you're battling cancer, or if you're battling fibromyalgia, you know, then what are you doing? You're just adding fuel to the fire. You're adding more conflict. You're adding more tension. You're adding, you know, more suffering into the mix than already exists. For a lot of people, you know, what's really missing is a sense of love, is a sense of self-love, is a sense of nurturing the areas of their psyche and of their internal equilibrium that are being ignored. There was actually one of the reasons that Lama Tsultrim was so pushed to do the work that she did with Feeding Your Demons was because she had a close friend named Terry Clifford, and Terry Clifford passed away due to cancer, and she had actually done 3 years of retreat. She did a traditional Lama's retreat in the Tibetan tradition, where you do 3 years, 3 months, and 3 days, and that's sort of the, you know, official mark of, okay, you know, you did the requisite amount of retreat to be a, you know, a sort of a Lama. But she had done this retreat, and she came out and she had got this terminal cancer diagnosis and passed away. And she told Lama Tsultrim, she was like, you know, I think one of the reasons that this happened is because I never dealt with my psychological issues. You know, I never dealt with my inner demons. It was all of this outward practice and visualizations and prostrations and you know, mantras and yogas, but I wasn't actually dealing with the psychological roots of so much of my suffering. And her feeling was that that basically metastasized into cancer.
So appreciate you bringing that up. So, do you want to share the about provocation?
Yes.
Did you do the third one?
The third one is time.
Okay.
The third one's important. It's an oft overlooked aspect of health. You know, we usually don't consider health. I mean, first of all, we don't consider health to be something that exists on a personal spectrum between
Yeah.
different kinds of people. And, you know, really good cutting edge modern Western medicine is starting to get there with more personalized medicine based on genetic information, you know, based on family lineage and, you know, family history of certain diseases. So we are coming around to it. But we've been doing it in Tibetan medicine for over 1,000 years. So I feel like, you know, there's probably a few more years of experience on the Tibetan tradition. But it's essentially recognizing that on top of that, we also have time conditions. We have conditions based on season. You know, certain illnesses accumulate during certain months and arise during other months based on the outer circumstances in the natural world. And that's very important, I think, for us. There's also things that shift on a 24-hour clock, you know, our sort of natural biorhythm. And that's something that, again, Western science just, you know, someone just received the Nobel Prize last year for coming up with a similar theory on a, you know, sort of 24-hour biorhythm. And yet again, we can look and say, oh, well, I'm glad we rediscovered this, but it's been in a lot of ancient medical traditions for a very long time.
And actually, do you mind just
Of
do them
course.
all again, then we'll get to the fourth.
Yeah, absolutely. So the four conditions, or the kyen, which actually cause dis-ease to arise based on those fundamental causes, are diet, which comes down to what we're eating, how it integrates with our own body, what the nature of those foods are, what the volume is. There's a lot of different aspects of diet. There's behavior, which again has these aspects of sort of physiological behavior and psychological behavior and spiritual behavior, and then our worldly conduct. And then we have time, which is relating to the seasons, hours of the day, and also the period of our own lives. And then we have provocation. And this is going to be the topic of whenever this book comes to be, it'll be the topic of it, which is known as dun in Tibetan, Gdon in Wiley, or Don. Dun refers to quite a few different things in the Tibetan tradition. The most common translation of the term is demon, but it's really quite reductive. It does certainly refer to these sorts of disembodied spirits, which often cause problems and can be a little problematic, coming from a very animistic society. This is definitely one meaning of dun. And medically speaking, it also refers to microorganisms. It refers to bacteria and viruses and so on and so forth. Something that's outside of us that we can't, you know, see with the naked eye, that influences our body and makes us ill. And then it also it refers to by way of the demons or the spirits, it refers to the impact on our bodies and on our state of health psychologically and physiologically that comes from the outer world, that comes from nature. So the interesting thing with the Tibetan perception of demons and the Tibetan perception of spirits and nature spirits, Jungpo, as we call them in Tibetan, is that they're basically the conscious force behind the activities in nature. So, we might have hail, or we might have rainstorms, or we might have earthquakes, or something along those lines. And we could have a scientific explanation for why this arose. But then for Tibetans, there would still be a scientific explanation, but it might be a spirit that resides in the trees, or it might be a spirit that resides in the sky, or a spirit that resides in the ground. And I think for, most people in the West, we hear things like that and we're like, oh, that's, that's sort of superstitious, and, it's not quite scientific, and I don't know how this can benefit me. But they came to understand a lot of truths through this philosophy. Tibetan medicine tells us, for instance, that if you pollute water sources, or if you pollute the air by burning a lot of really foul-smelling toxic substances, things that are considered to be dirty, in modern times, they throw plastic into this category and say this shouldn't be burned because the texts say not to burn things like this. So they know that when you burn that, eventually people get sick. Per their beliefs, we pollute the environment. This upsets the spirits that naturally embody and inhabit environment, sick, them getting sick and passing it on to us, or from them attacking us directly and making us ill. So the Tibetan understanding wasn't so far off from what's actually happening. We do know there's studies that have shown that in regions that have really high amounts of air pollution, the amount of mental disorders actually increases, especially amongst children. And that's a link that we don't really fully understand with our materialistic view of environmental science. We could say, okay, well, there's toxins that are released, and maybe those are, disseminated through the air or dissolved in the air, and that people breathe that in and it makes them ill. But we don't necessarily know how that would intersect with psychological health. We're based in this idea that neurotransmitter levels are really the main driving force behind things like depression. So why would, polluting the air or polluting the water cause those sorts of issues? So for Tibetans, the understanding that the planet is embodied, that it's inhabited, that we're not the only ones here, also brings a sense of personal responsibility. There's a sense of real emotional involvement in that. If you go and you dig into the ground without doing the appropriate rituals and looking at where you're digging into the ground, and if it's a particularly sensitive area, if you just do that, then there's a sense that you might be personally, physically harming like a sadak, like a landowner spirit that might abide in that same location. So instead of just having this materialistic view of, oh, carbon in, carbon out, what's my carbon footprint? If I use a lot of carbon, then I just have to produce a certain amount of renewable energy and it'll offset it. And, that's sort of where we're at. It's very materialistic, it's very reductive, and, that's the essence of modern environmental activism and environmental science. But we're missing this emotional component. And I think that that's a major part of the reason why we don't feel motivated sufficiently to really do anything to change it. We don't feel this personal onus to not cause harm to these other beings that are living in nature. We just feel like, oh, cut down a certain number of trees, but it's okay because we did this other thing that helped to, reduce carbon emissions in the atmosphere, and therefore it all balances out. But that's not necessarily true. Modern environmentalism is often sort of ignorant to causes surrounding things like genetically modified crops, or just, unhealthy agricultural practices where we're not rotating crops, and so on and so forth. And those all fall under the same category of environmentalism and ecology, but it's not treated that way in the West. It's not treated that way in modern times. And I think that if we step back into a more traditional understanding of ecology and of the world that we live in, then it might change the way that we feel about it. And I think that that's most important. Changing the narrative is really essential if we want to see actual change. We can't continue with the same neoliberal, consumerist-based, materialistic narrative and expect our activities to change, expect our deepest desires and wants to change, or expect us to replace love of the planet for, our love of personal success.
Yeah, it's so fantastic. I feel like there's so much these days around feeling, like the power of feeling in terms of creating change within our own psyche, but also being able to affect another, right? To help each other wake up and see what actually impacts our world.
Those emotional arguments work much better on us than analytical arguments. That's always been the case. And if you look at the way, what's the sort of, maybe a little bit overused, catchphrase for like marketing, it's like sex sells, that's the idea that we know works with marketing. If you throw some sex into it, it'll draw people in. But why is that? What's the mechanism behind that? It's our evolutionary imperative. They're using these really deep-seated evolutionary, tendencies that we have deep in our psyche and deep in our genetics, and they're using it against us. Companies like Coca-Cola or Pepsi or whatever can have a really sexy model, or have a sexy model surrounded by a number of other sexy models that want to get with that sexy model, and they're selling a friggin' brown beverage. They can convince us through these sort of emotional arguments that if you buy this product, then you will be able to get more sex. You'll be able to find someone who will have sex with you. And it's manipulative. It's using our deepest emotional tendencies that are largely out of our control, and it's using them to support consumerism. And I think it's the same for so much of what we deal with in the public world. It's so much of what's marketed to us. It's based on these emotional arguments and these things that we don't have a lot of conscious control over. If someone says to us, here's Pepsi Cola, it's filled with like this phosphoric acid, which might wear away your stomach lining, and a lot of sugar that's going to give you diabetes, and increase your triglyceride, and reduce your immune functions. It's like if you market something to someone based on analytics and fact, then we might say, oh, that doesn't sound very appealing at all. It doesn't really matter what it tastes like. That sounds awful. But they appeal to us on an emotional level. And I think that's what we need to do. We need to use that same sort of policy or that same concept to change the way that we're living. We need to sufficiently motivate ourselves to change and to push change upon the powers that be. We need to change the way that companies are running. We need to change the way that our government is structured. We need to really make much broader changes. But to motivate that, we need to change our narrative. We need to change the way that we perceive the world. We need to change the way that we perceive each other and relate with each other. And we need to change the way that we experience and relate with ourselves and our own bodies and our experience of reality.
I love that you're offering provocation as a path for that, for people to start
Totally.
seeing everything. I know you were saying, speaking of demons is simplifying it, but these kind of little demons that are in our feeling body and creating all these things in our world that are quite toxic, and that we could actually use our wisdom and our actual sense of what's right to do something else. Like we have that power, each of us. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it creates a very different experience as an embodied being on this planet. If you're
Yeah.
really taking into consideration the beings that you're sharing space with, and, the natural forces that are at work around us,
Mhm.
then, you're placed into a mandala then. That's a really different experience than this dualistic self and other with everything out there. I need to make my little house and lock my doors and keep myself protected from all the scary stuff out there, instead of recognizing that we're in a web. We're in this mandala.
I mean, your work is so important, and I hope people reach out to you and get to work with you and learn from you.
Yeah.
Considering you could continue on for weeks on this topic, just to end give our listeners some final thoughts of what they can do to support themselves to have vital relational health. 3 things that they could do in their daily life to support themselves. What would those be? I know it's a lot of
Hmm.
pressure, and don't worry, it doesn't have to be 3.
Okay, good. I I would say that at least one of those things,
Yeah.
it may even cover 2 of those things. One of them would certainly be to spend some time with introspection. Spend some time with ourselves, what we experience as ourselves, and try to get to the core of, why we function the way that we do. And there's so many permutations of that. There's the physiological level of, try to figure out what your own constitutional sort of orientation is, and base your approach to health on that. Don't base it on the latest fad diet that you've read about on Facebook or that your other friends are doing. Try to figure out what your own constitutional buildup is or makeup is, and then act based on that. And then there's also psychological permutations of it, or uh, sort of aspects of that, where we need to consider, what's really going on in our psyche, what's going on in our subconscious, what are the things that we're not identifying and addressing directly. And all of that takes introspection. It takes some self-knowledge. It takes a little bit of turning inward and seeing what's really going on in this moment, and not focusing so much on what's being marketed to us from the outside. So I think that's certainly one of them. I think another would really be to connect with others, to create communities, to create connection with other people, to break out of our individualism and see ourselves as really parts of society, because we're not going to have good psychological health if we don't have community. They've done a lot of studies to show that addiction is really largely a result of loneliness and of, feeling disconnected. And that connection is the real opposite. And, it's the real antithesis of addiction. And it's a cure for it. It's a way out of it. And I think, when the Buddha talks about addiction, this is a part of that cure. It's connecting, it's loving, it's, feeling the innate kinship that we share with other embodied conscious beings in this world, instead of constantly focusing on separating ourselves from them. So that would be certainly number two. And to see the world in its systems, auspicious interdependence, tendril. This is a foundational concept in Tibetan Buddhism as well as in Tibetan medicine. And from really understanding that, we can have a better picture of where we sit in reality. We exist based on strictly on this myriad array of causes and conditions. If you just look at the coffee you drink in the morning, and who grew those beans, who produced the substances that are used to help grow those beans, who's harvesting them, who's shipping them, who makes the plastic for the wrapping that they came in, who prepared it at the coffee shop, what machines are they using, who's paying for it. There's so many circumstances, who drove the truck bringing the coffee beans to the place where you had them. We don't nothing exists as this sort of isolated, uncompounded, entity. There's all these myriad causes and conditions. And if we understand that, if we see the world through its systems, instead of getting really stuck in these individual concepts of self and other absolute existence, then we'll have a more holistic view of things. And that'll help us to really take into consideration our own role in the dangerous systems that exist, and also our own role in the beautiful aspects of reality that exist, and the ways that we can augment our own engagement and our own behavior to create a healthier whole.
Incredible. So let's all go do those things.
Let's all go do those things. And remember that virtuous worldly conduct is the foundation of all good qualities. It's our basic nature, This is why in Vajrayana we say, like, bodhicitta can be sort of a part of the path, but it's also the result. We need to arouse bodhicitta. We need to give rise to the mind of enlightenment and to this altruistic intention. But we do that in order to eventually realize that that's actually the true state. That's actually its true radiant nature. And once we find that, there's no need to contrive it. Once we've really understood and internalized, the truths that quantum physicists are revealing for us, then we'll find that our basic expression is actually love, and that there's no need for us to force ourselves to be loving and force ourselves to be compassionate. Buddhism isn't really asking us to do that. It's asking us to shave away these layers of self-clinging and these layers of dualistic fixation and karmic vision, so that we can uncover our basic loving nature.
Yum. Thank you so much. I'm so
Thank
grateful
you.
for your
Thanks for having me.
wisdom and just the plethora of unconfused thoughts you can share with us today. It's refreshing.
Thank you.